Chapter 22 is called the lymphatic system and immune system. So this is kind of a combination system that involves both what we call lymphatics and then the immune system, which protects us from pathogens. And we're going to hopefully make the connection as we get started here in these videos. So let's begin with our list of topics. So we're going to talk about the function and structures of the lymphatic system. And again, this is going to include both structures that are involved in more of the lymphatic side, which is fluid homeostasis, and then also those organs and structures that are involved in the immune system component. So lymphatics really centers around collecting this excess interstitial fluid that accumulates around capillaries and then drains that fluid and returns it back to the bloodstream. So we're going to talk about that process. Then we're going to get into the immune system and break it down into what we call the innate immune system, which is kind of your first and second lines of defense against a pathogen. Innate means you're born with. So this component of your immune system functions immediately at birth and is always present the rest of your life. Whereas the adaptive immune system, which we refer to as our third line of defense, has to kind of mature and grow and develop with time. So your adaptive immune system actually will get better and better and better the more it experiences pathogens and defending you against them. And we break down the adaptive system into what's called cell-mediated immunity, which involves cells called cytotoxic T cells. And these cytotoxic T cells are helped by another type of T cell called helper T cells. We'll also talk about the humoral-mediated immunity, which involves B cells producing antibodies. And B cells also need help from what's called helper T cells. So these helper T cells are really important for your entire immune response. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the basic functions of our lymphatic/immune system. Number one is draining excess interstitial fluid from tissue and returning it to the bloodstream. So this gets us back to that concept in blood vessels where we talked about bulk flow and the imbalance that occurs at capillaries. So we have to be able to collect that extra fluid that gets filtered from blood capillaries, drain it out of that tissue in order to prevent edema, and then return it to the bloodstream. So we'll talk about that process first, then we'll get very briefly into what the lymphatics job is as far as dietary lipids. So this is focused a little more when we get to the digestive system. But when you absorb nutrients from your foods, most of those nutrients go directly into your bloodstream and then go to the liver. Recall the hepatic portal. Certain dietary lipids, fatty acids from your triglycerides, for example, as well as lipid-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K, actually get absorbed into your lymphatics and not directly into your bloodstream. So we'll just mention it briefly here and probably won't really discuss this again until we get to the digestive system. But it's important for you to know that your lymphatics plays a really important role in absorbing dietary lipids and then eventually transporting them into eventually your bloodstream. Third function, immune responses. So protecting you from pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, other pathogens, the toxins that certain pathogens might produce, any kind of foreign substance to the body, your immune system defends you against those foreign entities. Let's look at some of the anatomy. So we've obviously have to talk about lymph. This is just that extra interstitial fluid. It gets collected into what's called lymphatic capillaries, and then those capillaries kind of merge and get bigger and bigger So the other vessels are called just lymphatic vessels, and then there's some called lymphatic trunks, and then eventually lymph goes into two what we call ducts, the right lymphatic duct and what's known as the thoracic duct. So you can kind of see those on this drawing. This is called the thoracic duct because it comes up the thoracic cavity, and then you see a little duct here called the right lymphatic duct. Basically, all your lymph eventually goes into those two ducts, and then it drains into your subclavian veins. So that's where we return lymph to the bloodstream, at your subclavian veins. There's a little sac or reservoir at the bottom of the lymphatic duct called the cisterna chyli. That's where a lot of the lymph drains into from your abdomen and from your legs. So you'll notice all these green lines here are lymphatic vessels. So all that lymph that was collected eventually drains through these vessels. You'll notice along the way there are lymph nodes. So all these dots represent different lymph nodes that are going to filter the lymph. Also look for any kind of pathogens in that lymph before we send it back to the bloodstream. So you'll notice on this drawing, which would be, really the main anatomy picture to focus on in this chapter, these lymph nodes are given regional names quite often. So in your armpit, we've got axillary lymph nodes. In the groin, those are the inguinal lymph nodes. In your neck, there are cervical lymph nodes. So they're scattered throughout the body, but there's certain areas where there's clusters of lymph nodes, and typically they're named based on their location. Bone marrow and thymus are very important. Those are what we call primary lymphatic organs. Those are the organs that produce your immune cells. So your immune cells kind of all originate from bone marrow, and then some of these immune cells, the T cells, have to go to the thymus. And I'll point out the thymus right here. It lies just above your heart in your thoracic cavity. We'll talk about the spleen and what it does. You'll notice the spleen is in this upper left quadrant of your abdominal cavity. We'll talk about some other lymphatic tissue and nodules that house a lot of your immune cells. We'll talk about tonsils that are strategically located where pathogens like to get in. So pathogens like to enter through either your oral cavity, in the foods you might eat, or into your respiratory tract in the air you breathe. So tonsils are strategically located to get any pathogens that might be trying to penetrate into your tissues. And then we'll again talk about a lot of different immune cells, your T cells, your B cells, and some other ones. So that's kind of introducing your basic functions as well as some of the anatomy or organs we're going to be talking about. So let's start with this interstitial fluid that accumulates. So recall from the last chapter we talked about capillary exchange. So here are some capillaries shown in here, kind of in purple to represent that blood's kind of transitioning from oxygenated blood into deoxygenated blood. We're going to get filtration and reabsorption, but because filtration exceeds reabsorption, you're going to get accumulation of fluid in between these cells. And fluid in between cells is called interstitial fluid. So as that fluid accumulates, it's going to be collected. You can see this little arrow representing the collection of this interstitial fluid into these lymphatic capillaries. All right? And you'll notice that the lymphatic capillaries are very thin-walled. They have these little overlapping endothelial cells, which allows the fluid to enter, but it can't really exit the capillary. So as these lymphatic capillaries collect this fluid, there's a little bit of pressure that builds up in these capillaries. And that small amount of pressure is just enough to help that fluid drain through those lymphatic capillaries. All right? So we collect the interstitial fluid, then we call it lymph. So it's just in a different location. We can't call it interstitial anymore because it's not in between the tissue cells. So it's now called lymph. It enters through those overlapping endothelial cells. And then there are also valves. This is a very low pressure system, a lot like veins where there's very little pressure. So to help that lymph flow, there's the presence of these valves. All right, and flow of lymph requires a lot of the same things your venous return requires. So muscle contraction helps, and then there's just this very small pressure gradient that helps drain that lymph through these lymphatic vessels. Eventually, these lymphatic vessels start to get bigger and bigger, and then they finally form the two ducts. So all the lymph in your body eventually drains into one or the other lymphatic ducts. You have the thoracic duct, which kind of originates off that cisterna chyli, goes up the thoracic cavity, and then that lymph is going to be dumped into the left subclavian vein. And then the right lymphatic duct drains lymph into the right subclavian vein. All right, so you can kind of see here that here's that thoracic duct coming up, and then it attaches to that subclavian vein. And then over here is the right lymphatic duct dumping into the right subclavian vein. Now, this is one of these examples in the human body that where we see that we're not symmetric. In that lymph, from everything below the diaphragm, so both legs, your abdomen, your entire left side of the body, all drains into the thoracic duct. All right, whereas only the right head and neck, right arm, right chest drain into the right lymphatic duct. So this is a good drawing to show, depending on where the lymph comes from, what duct does it use to eventually drain into the subclavian veins. Okay, so that's lymph flow. Now, as the lymph flows through those lymphatic vessels, it passes through a number of lymph nodes. So now we have a way to, in essence, check to see if there's any pathogens out there, right? Because if you happen to have a pathogen maybe in a cut on your arm, but we've drained fluid from that area, we're going to see whether there's bacteria in there because it's going to pass through lymph nodes. So that's what connects this lymphatic system to your immune system. All right, the connection is that if you're draining fluid from every part of the body, let's pass that fluid through lymph nodes and see if there's any microbes present. So we're kind of surveying the entire body by looking at this lymphatic tissue that came from all over the body. And if there's a bacterium present, then we know there's an infection, and we have to activate the immune system so that lymph node will get activated, and there'll be immune cells that now know to go look for this certain pathogen. All right, so that's the connection between the lymphatics and your immune system. So that's going to lead us to this drawing. We might as well start a new video where we're going to now transition into this immune system component. So we're kind of done with the lymphatic portion. So now we're going to look at, all right, how does our body protect us from any kind of invasion of a pathogen such as a virus or a bacterium?